Canada is looking to replace its aging fleet of submarines.
We are going to be sending them weapons and they're going to be paying for them. We will manufacture it and they're going to be paying for it.
Canada's Prime Minister spending the day talking up the country's defense spending as the U.S. president demands more.
Canada is looking to replace its aging fleet of subs, potentially worth tens of billions of dollars.
The German-Norwegian partnership is one of the two finalists for this.
Tariffs could threaten weapons manufacturing.
Carney is committed to hitting the NATO 2% of GDP on defense spending target.
Breaking news from Washington. Donald Trump has gone on the offensive, demanding that Canada hand over $20 billion worth of submarine contracts to American shipyards. The reaction from Ottawa? A flat refusal. And in that instant, one of America's most critical defense pipelines collapsed. From the docks of Norfolk, Virginia to the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the fallout is immediate. An industrial heartland suddenly stunned, as Canada signals it will not fund a single U.S. submarine hull. What was supposed to be a lifeline for American defense has just been severed, and tonight, the Pentagon is scrambling to contain a crisis that could leave America's naval edge in jeopardy. For months, Donald Trump has warned that America's defense industry was being strangled by unfair trade practices and foreign favoritism. He promised to bring submarine construction back to American shipyards, insisting that only U.S. steel, U.S. labor, and U.S. technology could guarantee national security. But trade tensions with Canada were already boiling. Earlier this summer, Washington slapped tariffs on Canadian aluminum and steel, key inputs for submarine hulls. Ottawa, furious, retaliated with quotas and export caps. Now, with Trump demanding a $20 billion contract to flow south, Canada has drawn a red line, and America's long-standing defense partnership is suddenly at risk. Before we dive deeper, hit the like button and subscribe. It's the simplest way to support the channel, and you won't want to miss what's coming up next. Let's get started. The breaking point came this morning in Ottawa. Canadian officials formally rejected Washington's demand for $20 billion in submarine procurement contracts Trump had publicly declared would save thousands of American jobs in cities like Groton, Connecticut, and Newport News, Virginia. Instead of funneling the work south, Canada announced it will keep the contracts within its own yards, awarding construction to Halifax and Vancouver shipbuilders. The shockwaves were immediate. Trump, furious, accused Canada of gutting the American defense base and warned that without these deals, U.S. naval supremacy could be compromised. In practical terms, the rejection halts a pipeline of critical steel, electronics, and marine technology that American yards were counting on. Suppliers from Ohio's foundries to Wisconsin's electronics hubs had already begun ramping up production. Now, billions in anticipated orders have vanished overnight. Defense analysts say this isn't just another trade spat. It's a rupture in a decades-long arrangement where Canada often outsourced heavy naval work to U.S. partners. For the first time in modern history, America's northern ally has openly chosen to shut out U.S. shipyards, rewriting the rules of defense cooperation. The ripple effects across the United States were felt almost instantly. In Washington, Pentagon insiders described a scramble to rewrite procurement schedules and redirect funding streams. But on the ground, in America's industrial heartland, the consequences were far more tangible. Thousands of workers who had been expecting a surge of overtime hours and long-term job security woke up to headlines announcing that the $20 billion pipeline of submarine contracts had vanished overnight. In Groton, Connecticut, home to one of the nation's most vital submarine shipyards, labor leaders warned that layoffs could begin within weeks if no replacement orders are secured. The same message echoed from Newport News, Virginia, where Huntington Ingalls Industries had already geared up facilities to accommodate a major Canadian build. Union representatives there pointed out that steel already rolled in Pittsburgh, welders already hired in Norfolk, and suppliers already contracted in Ohio now face cancellation notices. One veteran machinist summed it up bitterly. Trump promised us a flood of work. Canada just pulled the plug, and we're the ones left standing in the dry dock. The pain goes well beyond coastal yards. In Ohio's Mahoning Valley, specialized steel foundries that had ramped up production of hardened submarine hull plates are now staring at empty order books. In Wisconsin, electronics firms that manufacture sonar arrays and communication modules for undersea vessels report immediate freezes in purchase orders. Even in inland states like Kansas and Missouri, smaller subcontractors that provide wiring, pumps, and precision castings are caught in the fallout. For many, the cancellation is not merely a missed opportunity, it's an existential threat to survival. The emotional blow is equally significant. For months, Trump had toured American industrial towns, declaring that the submarine deal with Canada would be the anchor of a broader defense revival. He tied it directly to his campaign promise of protecting American workers and revitalizing manufacturing hubs that had suffered for decades. In city after city, Toledo, Youngstown, Norfolk, Charleston, crowds cheered when he pledged that billions in naval work would stay in the United States. Now, those same communities are facing headlines that undercut every promise. The sense of betrayal, some analysts say, could carry political consequences that extend far beyond the shop floor. For American workers, the timing could not be worse. Inflationary pressures have already strained household budgets. Interest rates remain elevated, making credit for small businesses more difficult to secure. In states like Pennsylvania and Michigan, where communities were just beginning to rebound from earlier factory closures, the loss of promised submarine contracts feels like déjà vu. Another wave of uncertainty washing over towns still recovering from the last. Local officials are warning that without immediate federal intervention, unemployment claims could spike by the tens of thousands within a matter of months. In Congress, the reaction broke along familiar lines. Trump allies rushed to blame Canada, accusing Ottawa of betrayal and warning of dire national security consequences. One senator from Texas declared that Canada has chosen to weaken the arsenal of democracy. Democrats, meanwhile, highlighted Trump's aggressive tariff policies as the root cause of the rupture, pointing out that the White House itself lit the fuse by targeting Canadian steel and aluminum earlier this year. What both sides quietly acknowledge, however, is that America's defense industrial base is suddenly staring at a hole worth tens of billions of dollars, and no easy way to fill it. Trump himself, according to insiders, is livid. In private meetings, he has accused Canada of siding with America's enemies by denying U.S. shipyards the contracts. Publicly, he has vowed retaliation, hinting at new tariffs, possible restrictions on cross-border defense cooperation, and even calls to relocate certain NATO facilities out of Canada. Yet for all the fiery rhetoric, the facts remain unchanged. The submarines will not be built in America. For now, Canadian workers in Halifax and Vancouver will cut the steel, while American workers from Connecticut to Ohio wait for phones that no longer ring. The immediate impact is a collapse in confidence. In defense towns across America, residents are asking the same question. If even a close ally like Canada won't deliver, what does that mean for the future of U.S. industry? The shock has turned personal, and the fallout is only just beginning. Canada's decision to block American shipyards from $20 billion on submarine contracts is not just an economic story. It is a geopolitical earthquake that reverberates across alliances, trade routes, and strategic balances in ways that Americans cannot ignore. For decades, Washington assumed that defense cooperation with Ottawa was automatic, a natural extension of shared borders, shared values, and shared threats. But Canada's refusal marks a pivot. It signals that Ottawa is no longer willing to tie its own defense posture and industrial base entirely to the United States. Instead, it is charting an independent course, one that could rewire how global defense contracts are awarded, and who ultimately controls the supply of advanced naval technology. The symbolism is as powerful as the numbers. Submarines are not ordinary commodities like lumber or soybeans. They are the backbone of modern naval power, the quiet engines of deterrence that patrol beneath the oceans. For Canada to award construction to domestic yards rather than relying on America's long dominant facilities is in effect a declaration that Ottawa no longer accepts U.S. primacy in every aspect of defense production. Analysts in Washington say it amounts to a vote of confidence in Canadian self-sufficiency, and a vote of no confidence in Trump's economic approach to allies. Already, allies in Europe and Asia are watching closely. Nations like Australia, Japan, and the United Kingdom, which have traditionally leaned on American yards for their own submarine cooperation programs, are asking whether Canada's bold move sets a precedent. If Ottawa can defy Washington and still maintain NATO ties, why not them? The fear inside the Pentagon is that this moment may accelerate a trend toward fragmented procurement, with each country building at home rather than pooling resources through the United States. That means higher costs, less integration, and, critically, fewer guaranteed contracts for American firms. The economic stakes are enormous. The $20 billion Canada withheld from U.S. yards does not exist in isolation. Defense contracts are deeply interconnected. If Canada pours that money into Halifax and Vancouver, it strengthens Canadian suppliers, toolmakers, and technology firms. Those same firms could then compete for export deals with third countries. In other words, today's rejection is tomorrow's competitive edge, not just for Canada, but for anyone buying from Canada rather than the United States. Europe's smaller navies, or even emerging markets in Asia, might find Canadian-built subs more accessible and politically less controversial than their US-made counterparts. That prospect alarms Washington because it threatens America's unique selling point: scale. For decades, the U.S. defense industry has relied on being the largest, most interconnected production base in the world. Subcontractors in dozens of states supply parts for ships and planes that are ultimately assembled in a handful of coastal hubs. That scale has kept costs down and ensured political support, since jobs are distributed across congressional districts. Canada's decision chips away at that model. If allies begin diversifying away from U.S. suppliers, the scale shrinks, costs rise, and the political coalition that supports massive defense spending weakens. Trump himself has framed the standoff as proof that allies are ungrateful. In speeches and Truth Social posts, he has accused Ottawa of turning its back on American workers, and hinted that NATO burden-sharing debates will intensify. But critics argue that Trump's own tariff-first policies box the United States into this position. By slapping duties on Canadian steel and aluminum, the administration directly undercut the materials that would have built those very submarines. Ottawa, facing domestic pressure to protect its own mills and shipyards, sees the opportunity to flip the script. Instead of being dependent on U.S. buyers, Canada is now positioning itself as an exporter of finished defense platforms. The geopolitical implications extend far beyond North America. China and Russia, both expanding their undersea fleets, are studying the rift with interest. For Beijing, a weaker U.S. industrial base is a strategic gift. If America's yards are underutilized, its cost per submarine rises, its delivery timelines slow, and its ability to maintain a global naval presence diminishes. Russia, though constrained by sanctions, benefits in perception. It can point to fractures within NATO as evidence that the alliance is unraveling. Even countries in the global south, often overlooked in these debates, may sense opportunity. Brazil, India, and South Korea, all of which aspire to expand naval capacity, could see Canada's decision as a model for asserting independence from Washington. What makes Canada's move so destabilizing is that it strikes at the intersection of economics and security. A trade spat over timber or dairy can be patched over with subsidies or side agreements. But submarines are different. They are strategic assets, linked to nuclear deterrence, maritime dominance, and alliance commitments. For Canada to withhold contracts is to send a message not only about economics, but about sovereignty. Ottawa is effectively telling Washington, our defense industry will no longer be an appendage of yours. That message, once delivered, cannot easily be walked back. The longer-term consequences could reshape the entire defense ecosystem. Already, Canadian officials are in quiet talks with European partners about potential technology-sharing agreements. France, Germany, and even the United Kingdom, each with their own naval industries, see Canada's pivot as an opportunity to form joint ventures outside of Washington's shadow. If such collaborations materialize, the result would be a parallel supply chain of NATO-standard submarines that bypasses U.S. contractors altogether. In effect, America could wake up to find itself excluded from projects in which it once dominated. For Trump, the political stakes are no less significant. He has built his brand on the promise of restoring American strength and negotiating from a position of power. Yet the submarine dispute reveals a different picture, one in which allies are willing to say no, even at the risk of confrontation. The domestic political fallout could be severe. In key swing states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, where manufacturing jobs are central to family livelihoods, voters may ask why Trump's tariff policies resulted in fewer orders, not more. Democrats are already preparing to frame the loss of the $20 billion contract as the latest example of economic nationalism backfiring. Internationally, America's negotiating credibility takes a hit. Trade partners who once feared retaliation from Washington may now feel emboldened. If Canada, a country long viewed as the junior partner in North American defense, can defy Trump and survive, what's to stop larger economies from doing the same? Officials in Tokyo and Seoul, both engaged in sensitive defense procurements, are reportedly recalculating their exposure to American suppliers. European leaders, facing rising populism at home, may use Canada's defiance as justification to favor their own industries, rather than awarding contracts abroad. The economics ripple outward. Defense spending is not just about warships and submarines. It is about the research, patents, and intellectual property that spill into civilian markets. By localizing submarine construction, Canada ensures that advanced technologies, from sonar to battery systems to stealth coatings, will be incubated in its own labs rather than in U.S. facilities. That means Canadian universities, Canadian engineers, and Canadian startups will reap the benefits. For Silicon Valley firms already nervous about supply chains, this is an ominous signal. The next wave of breakthroughs in materials, science, or propulsion may emerge in Vancouver rather than California. Energy security and global shipping routes also come into play. Submarines are not only tools of warfare, but also guardians of maritime trade lanes. If America struggles to maintain its undersea fleet while Canada invests heavily in its own, the balance of patrol responsibilities in the Atlantic and Pacific could shift. Ottawa has already hinted that it will expand Arctic patrols, leveraging its geography to assert control over northern shipping routes. For Washington, this represents a dual loss: less influence over Canadian contracts and less control over critical sea lanes at a time when climate change is opening new passages across the Arctic. The bigger question is what this means for America's role in NATO. For decades, the United States has shouldered the majority of alliance spending, often with the implicit understanding that allies would recycle some of those dollars back into U.S. defense firms. Canada's refusal breaks that pattern. If other allies follow, NATO could evolve into a looser federation of semi-autonomous defense industries, each prioritizing its own workers over alliance cohesion. Such a shift would not only weaken Washington's leverage, but could also embolden adversaries who sense disunity. And yet there is a paradox. By asserting independence, Canada may actually strengthen its standing among European and Asian partners, who increasingly value suppliers not directly tied to Washington's political cycles. For Ottawa, this is a chance to become a middle power hub, a country that bridges U.S. technology standards with global markets. For Washington, it is a nightmare scenario, the steady erosion of influence by a neighbor once considered a junior partner. Trump's response will determine how deep the fracture goes. If he doubles down with tariffs and threats, he risks pushing Canada further into alternative alliances. If he concedes and seeks compromise, he risks appearing weak in the eyes of his base. Either way, the submarine contracts are gone, and the message is clear. America no longer dictates the terms of every deal. In a world where allies now feel free to chart their own course, Washington faces a sobering reality. Economic nationalism may have secured headlines, but it has also accelerated the very decline it was meant to prevent. The question now is simple but urgent. What happens next? With $20 billion in submarine contracts already lost, Washington faces a series of difficult choices, none of them easy, all of them high stakes. Inside the Pentagon, planners are scrambling to identify alternative pathways. One option is to accelerate domestic procurement by pouring federal dollars into U.S. shipyards. Congress could authorize emergency funding, effectively replacing the Canadian orders with new Navy contracts. But that comes with a steep price tag, likely tens of billions more in taxpayer spending at a time when deficits are already ballooning. Another option is to court new foreign buyers, persuading allies in Asia or the Middle East to award contracts that had been expected to go to Canada. Yet those deals take years to negotiate, and trust in American reliability has already been shaken. For Trump, the political stakes could not be higher. He has staked his credibility on the claim that his tariff policies would protect American jobs and revitalize U.S. manufacturing. The optics of Canadian workers in Halifax cutting steel, while American welders in Groton are sent home, threaten to undercut that message. Allies of the former president insist he will retaliate, with new tariffs on Canadian defense goods and possible restrictions on cross-border trade. But critics argue such measures would only deepen the divide, pushing Ottawa further toward alternative alliances in Europe and Asia. The economic fallout is also forward-looking. Industry analysts warn that without Canada's participation, U.S. defense firms may struggle to maintain production lines at optimal scale. That means higher costs not just for submarines, but for aircraft carriers, destroyers, and even civilian aerospace projects that share suppliers. In practice, this could raise the price tag for everything from commercial aircraft built in Seattle to advanced battery systems manufactured in Michigan. Consumers, too, will feel the pinch as defense-related inflation spills into the broader economy. Globally, the submarine dispute accelerates an already visible shift toward multipolarity. Canada's refusal signals to other mid-sized economies that defiance of Washington is no longer unthinkable. European officials are already floating the idea of joint procurement programs that exclude U.S. firms. Asian powers, long accustomed to Washington's dominance, are considering whether it makes more sense to diversify their defense supply chains now rather than later. In this sense, the real future outlook is not only about contracts, but about credibility. Can the United States still guarantee loyalty from allies when its own trade policies make cooperation politically toxic? The stakes extend to the strategic balance of power. America's undersea fleet is already stretched thin by commitments in the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Arctic. Delays in production or cancellations of Allied orders could weaken deterrence at the very moment rivals are growing stronger. China continues to roll out advanced submarines at a rapid pace, Russia, despite sanctions, is investing heavily in next-generation undersea technology. If American shipyards face gaps in orders, the timeline for delivering new vessels will lengthen, giving adversaries breathing room. What happens in the next 12 months will determine whether this is a temporary rupture or a long-term shift. If Trump and Congress move quickly to replace lost contracts, the damage could be contained. But if the rift deepens, America may find itself confronting a more unsettling reality. A world where allies no longer look automatically to U.S. yards, U.S. steel, and U.S. workers as their first choice. The submarine dispute is a warning shot, not just about defense economics, but about America's place in the global order. Future contracts for ships, planes, even emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and warfare may now be contested terrain where Washington is no longer guaranteed the upper hand. For the United States, the collapse of this single deal could be the beginning of a new era, one in which allies chart their own path, rivals exploit divisions, and the American defense base struggles to maintain its once unquestioned dominance. What began as a $20 billion contract dispute has turned into something far larger, a test of American strength, credibility, and resilience. Canada's refusal to award submarine contracts to U.S. yards is more than a business setback. It's a signal that Washington's grip on allied defense cooperation may be slipping. For American workers, the loss is immediate. For America's global posture, the questions are only beginning. Will Congress step in to shore up the industrial base, or will rivals seize the moment to press their advantage? If you found today's breakdown useful, make sure to like this video and subscribe. We track the developments shaping North America's economic future and national security, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Drop a comment below. Do you think Trump's tariff policies are protecting American workers, or are they driving allies into new alliances?